I was standing at the observation window when it happened. The station I had been assigned to, Relay Post Caven 7, sat at the outer edge of the Dravhari territorial boundary, a diplomatic outpost that existed precisely for moments like this one, a meeting between species, a reaching across the dark. I had been posted here for 11 years as an intelligence observer for the Galactic Coalition, and in those 11 years, I had never once felt the need to look away from the window. It was a small and perhaps slightly ridiculous point of professional pride, but it was mine. I looked away that day. Ambassador Ilara Voss had arrived 3 days before the meeting on a ship called the Cordelia, a mid-sized diplomatic runner with no weapons registry and a crew of 40. She had come to the central platform unarmed, carrying only a translation device and a leather folder of documents she had prepared by hand. I had reviewed her full credentials before her arrival. She was 44 years old. She had spent 12 years studying Dravhari language and culture, before the coalition even confirmed that a formal meeting was logistically possible. She spoke their primary dialect without a translator and without an accent, which was something no non-Dravhari had ever managed before. She had written 3 academic papers on Dravhari political philosophy that several Dravhari scholars had cited in their own work, without knowing the author was human. She had named her eldest son after a Dravhari concept that translated roughly as the peace that lives between storms. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment. The Dravhari High Executor met her on the platform with 16 armed attendants, arranged in ceremonial formation. I watched through the observation feed as Ilara stepped forward and bowed in the formal Dravhari greeting posture, left hand pressed flat against her chest, right hand open and extended toward the other party. The gesture meant, in their language, I carry nothing hidden. The precision of it was notable. She had clearly practiced it many times, because she executed it without the small hesitation that even native speakers sometimes showed when performing a formal gesture under pressure. It was exactly right. Every angle, every distance between her fingers, every degree of inclination in her spine, exactly right. The High Executor did not return the greeting. He looked at her for a long, deliberate moment. The broadcast was live across 19 star systems, 40 billion viewers watching a first formal contact between species. The coalition had required the broadcast as a condition of the meeting. Transparency, they had called it. A record of good faith between peoples. The High Executor said, in Dravhari, "The creature has learned our gestures. This does not make it less of a creature." Ilara Voss did not flinch. "I will spend the rest of my life thinking about the fact that she did not flinch," she said, calmly. In perfect Dravhari, "I come with proposals from the United Earth government regarding trade access, navigational rights, and a mutual research agreement that our scientists believe will benefit both our peoples. I would be honored to present these proposals to you and to your advisors." He let her finish. He even nodded once, the slight incline of the head that in Dravhari culture signals that you have heard and are considering the words presented to you. For a fraction of a second I thought, watching the feed, that perhaps I had misjudged something, that the nod was real, that we were about to watch something ordinary and good happen on a platform between the stars. Then he gestured to the attendant standing on his left. It happened in 4 seconds. I know that, because I went back and counted the recording frames later, alone in my quarters, unable to sleep, needing to know exactly how long it had taken to end something that had taken 12 years to build. 4 seconds from the gesture to the moment Ilara Voss fell to the platform floor without making a sound. She did not make a sound. Her translation device clattered across the metal surface and spun to a stop near the platform edge. The leather folder skidded open when it hit the floor, and the pages she had prepared by hand, the proposals, the frameworks, the carefully worded invitations to begin something worth building, scattered in every direction, the way birds scatter when something passes through them that they did not see coming. The High Executor looked directly into the broadcast feed. He said, "The Dravhari Empire does not negotiate with primitive infestations. Let this be understood across all channels, in all languages, for all who require the lesson." Then the broadcast cut. For a moment lasting somewhere between 5 seconds and forever, there was silence across every coalition communication channel I could monitor. Not the silence of a signal problem, the silence of 40 billion people trying to understand what they had just seen, the silence of a stone that has landed on the surface of water, present, real, taking up space in the world, but not yet fallen through. I pressed my hand against the cold observation glass and stared at the empty platform below, where the pages were still drifting in the slow environmental circulation of the station's outer walkway. I stayed there without moving and without reaching for my reporting tablet, because what I had just watched was not a professional event. It was a human being who had spent her life trying to speak peace in a language that was not hers, falling to a platform floor 4 seconds after she began the speech she had prepared for 12 years. Then I made myself move. I went to my desk. I began my work. Within the hour, the galaxy erupted. The Veluan Collective issued a formal and detailed condemnation. The Shari Trade Federation suspended all diplomatic contact with the Dravari Empire. 7 smaller species filed emergency declarations with the Coalition Council. The Pelrani ambassadors released a joint statement calling the act a wound against the concept of contact itself. Political voices across 30 species poured into every available channel, speeches and demands and expressions of outrage and calls for sanctions, and the entire procedural noise of a galactic community trying to respond to something that had no established response protocol, because no established protocol had anticipated needing one. I monitored all of it. I documented and I reported. I filed 17 intelligence memos in the first 6 hours. I cataloged reactions by species and by tone and by probable diplomatic consequence. I did the job cleanly and efficiently, because doing the job meant I did not have to think, and not thinking was what I needed for a while. But underneath everything, underneath the professional processing and the systematic monitoring and the careful documentation, one observation sat quietly and refused to leave. The humans had not said anything. That was more than unusual. In 11 years of studying human behavior, I had learned one truth that held more consistently than any other. Humans responded loudly and immediately to perceived injustice. It was not a flaw in their character. It was simply how they were built. They felt things quickly, and they expressed those feelings quickly. When something made them angry, you knew within minutes. When something broke their hearts, they said so. They wore their immediate emotional truth on the surface of themselves, and they wore it fast. And this made them simultaneously difficult to manage in diplomatic settings, and strangely compelling to observe, because you always knew where they actually stood. 6 hours after the broadcast, not a single official human channel had transmitted anything. No statement from the United Earth government. No response from the Human Coalition Liaison Office, which had standing protocol to issue formal acknowledgement of any incident involving a human national within 90 minutes of confirmation. No reaction from any of Earth's major media networks. No emergency communication from the Cordelia, which had been parked at its waypoint position throughout the meeting and had certainly received the broadcast in real time. 3 separate coalition relay stations had attempted to hail human vessels currently in transit through the region. None had responded. I ran a systematic check. All human frequencies, all known communication bands, emergency channels, diplomatic lines, trade networks, scientific relay frequencies, standard hailing bands. Every frequency and every band I had a record of, checked twice. Nothing. Not interference noise. Not jamming static. Not the broken signal pattern of a compromised transmitter or a system that had suffered damage. Clean, complete, deliberate silence. The specific quality of many transmitters that have all decided, at the same moment, to say nothing at all. I sat with that for a long time. Then I opened a new report. At the top I typed, Possible communication failure, human networks. I stared at that heading. Then I deleted possible and changed it to deliberate. Then I changed failure to suspension, because failure implied something had broken on its own, and what I was observing had the character of something decided. My supervisor, Orvith Koss, senior coalition analyst, 15 years in the directorate, the kind of professional who had seen enough surprises to be suspicious of alarm, reviewed my report quickly and sent it back with a brief note. It said, Overcorrection. Humans are likely processing grief. Monitor and report in 48 hours. I did not respond to the note. I continued monitoring. By the end of the first full day, 9 coalition probe hailings directed at human vessels or installations had received no response. By the end of the second day, 22. By the end of the third day, 3 separate coalition ships had attempted direct contact with human vessels in neutral space, approaching at proper hailing distance, running full-spectrum signal broadcasts, using emergency override frequencies that regulations required every crewed vessel to acknowledge. All 3 ships reported identically. The human vessels changed no course, ran no identification beacons, acknowledged no signal on any frequency. They moved through space, like objects that happened to have internal power, but had otherwise removed themselves from the category of things that communicated. By the 4th day, I had filed 3 more reports and received 3 more variations of the same response. I started pulling historical files, not the diplomatic summaries. Those were edited documents, cleaned and simplified for coalition consumption, written to make human history legible to species with very different historical trajectories. I requested the raw academic archives, the unfiltered documentation packages, submitted as part of the human government's first contact cultural disclosure. Dense, difficult documents, full of internal references that required significant background to contextualize. Most analysts had scanned them once and filed them. I had read them in my first year at the post, but not with the eyes I had now, and not with a specific question behind my reading. I spent 16 hours without stopping. My secondary processing nodes began throwing thermal caution warnings around hour 12. I ignored them and kept reading. What I found was not surprising in the individual facts. I knew the broad shape of human history already. What was surprising was the pattern underneath the facts, the structural pattern that only became visible when you looked at the whole arc of their past from a particular angle, with a particular question in mind. Humans were not a naturally aggressive species. I want to be very clear about that, because it is important to everything that followed. They were not expansionist by instinct, not dominant by preference, not interested in conflict for its own sake. Their most celebrated figures across recorded history were almost never military commanders. They were healers, scientists, artists, explorers, philosophers, builders. Their oldest and most beloved stories were journeys, not conquest stories, but the long and difficult process of traveling through danger towards something worth reaching. Home, understanding, each other. But there was something else in the pattern. When something they had built with care and patience was taken from them through deliberate, preventable cruelty, when something they had worked on and hoped for and invested themselves in was destroyed in front of them, they did not simply absorb the loss and adjust their expectations accordingly. They had a word in one of their older languages for what happened then: resolve. It appeared across their history and contexts that suggested it meant something specific and important. Not the resolve to retaliate in kind, not reactive aggression, but the resolve to ensure that the class of thing done to them could not be done again. They reorganized the problem from the ground up. They did not simply respond to the immediate threat. They restructured their position so that the nature of the threat itself changed. The historical cases all had the same shape. An aggressor that had taken something from humanity encountered initial reactive resistance, and then, over a period that varied but was never short, found that humanity had quietly and methodically changed the terms of the situation in ways the aggressor had not anticipated and could not easily reverse. Every single case. I sat back at the end of 16 hours with thermal warnings flickering across my displays, and I looked at the stars outside my window, and I thought, the Dravhari had looked at those 4 seconds on a platform and called it a lesson delivered. They had made the same mistake that every force in human history had eventually made. They had confused the silence after the strike for the silence of defeat. And I was sitting here, at the edge of their territory, watching what was actually happening, and I suspected I was nearly alone in understanding that the silence was not defeat at all. I spent 3 hours writing the most careful intelligence assessment of my career. I presented the communication blackout in complete detail, the historical pattern analysis with specific citations, the behavioral markers that distinguished reactive silence from strategic silence. I concluded plainly, the current silence was not grief. It was deliberate. It was coordinated. It was the specific quiet that precedes not collapse but reorganization. I added, at the end, recommended action. Begin immediate diplomatic outreach. I sent it with the highest available priority flag. Orvith returned it 4 hours later. The priority flag had been removed. The note read, interesting framework. Not actionable on current evidence. Continue standard monitoring. I read that note for a long time. Then I walked to my personal storage, took out the emergency pack I had assembled years ago as a precaution I had half expected to be unnecessary, checked its contents, and placed it next to the door of my quarters within arm's reach of where I slept. Then I went back to my desk and continued monitoring. That night I wrote a letter to my family on the homeworld. I told them I was well. I told them the station was quiet. I said I would try to call soon. I did not tell them about the silence, or the historical patterns, or the thing I had found in 16 hours of reading that had been sitting behind my eyes like a stone I could not put down. But at the end, I told them I loved them, specifically, in words I did not always remember to use. And I sent it before I could think too carefully about why today felt like a day when it was important to say that clearly. Outside the window, the stars were exactly where they had always been. And somewhere in the dark between them, humanity was very quiet. And I had been studying them long enough to understand the difference between the quiet of grief and the quiet of something that had stopped warning you. I just did not yet know what it was going to look like when the quiet finally ended. I suspected it was not going to look like anything the galaxy was prepared for. I moved the go bag from next to the door to next to my desk, where I could reach it without standing up. Then I sat in the dark, watching my monitoring board, and I waited. On the 9th day of the silence, a coalition survey drone disappeared. It was a routine automated probe, the third such drone sent into the outer boundary of what the navigational charts designated as human-adjacent space that week. The first two had returned with clean data. This third one reached its scheduled waypoint, transmitted a standard check-in signal, and then produced nothing further. The Coalition Navigation Office logged it as probable equipment malfunction. Equipment failures happened. They were an accepted cost of probe operations. I flagged it in my personal monitoring system and sent a note to Orvith, requesting we hold off on further drones in that corridor until we understood the first one's fate. He approved the request without comment. The probe did not return. It did not resume transmitting. No wreckage appeared on any scanner. No debris field, no residual energy signature, no malfunction beacon of any kind. It had ceased to exist as a tracked object, cleanly and completely, as if something had reached into the space between the stars and simply switched it off. Equipment failures leave a trace. They produce artifacts, partial signals, power cascade signatures, the specific electromagnetic fingerprint of a navigation system going dark on its own. This produced nothing. I lay awake for a long time that night, looking at the ceiling, thinking about how long it takes to learn to make something disappear without leaving a trace, and what that kind of learning implies about the scale of preparation behind it. On day 14, I wrote my evacuation recommendation and sent it directly to the Coalition Council's emergency channel. I did not consult Orvith first. I presented the complete picture: the silence, the missing drone, the sensor grid I had found charting approaches to human space from 6 directions, the classified programs in the human registry, listed as numbers with no descriptions, the directional consolidation of human vessel movements. The council reviewed it in 4 hours and declined, 6 votes to 2. I went back to my desk. I moved the go bag from next to my door to next to my desk, within reach of my chair. Then I sat in the dark, with the stars outside the window, and I thought about a woman who had believed that the right words in the right language could build a bridge across any distance. She had not been wrong. She had simply been dealing with someone who did not want a bridge. And now, somewhere in the dark between the stars, the people who had sent her were sitting in the quiet and saying nothing, and the universe was calling it weakness. And I was possibly the only person in my organization who understood that the universe was very, very wrong. The silence stretched into its 3rd week, and the galaxy made a decision about it. Not a formal decision, not one anyone voted on or discussed openly. The kind of decision that happens gradually, distributed across thousands of conversations and political analyses and media broadcasts. As a collection of individuals, each separately arrives at the same conclusion, without having coordinated their arrival. The galaxy decided that the silence was sad, perhaps, the way a public tragedy is sad, but that it was not dangerous. This is something I had watched happen before, across many years of professional monitoring. There is a window, early in any unsettling development, When the uncertainty generates genuine caution, people pay close attention, they modify their behavior, they ask careful questions. But if the development continues without producing an immediate consequence, if the unsettling thing simply persists without the crisis materializing in the expected time frame, the mind's threat processing begins to downgrade the alarm. The attention becomes selective, then background, then something close to normalization. The uncomfortable explanation gets replaced with a more comfortable one, not because the comfortable one is better supported by evidence, but because living with extended discomfort is something the mind resists without conscious instruction. The Dravhari helped the normalization along considerably. Their communications office released 4 statements in the 3rd week. Each one was more confident in tone than the last. The first described humanity's silence as a dignified recognition of natural hierarchies. The second characterized it as the withdrawal of a species confronted with its own limitations. The third distributed analysis pieces through allied media networks arguing that the blackout represented a species-level trauma response, that humanity had simply been unable to process the reality of its own smallness in a galaxy that had existed long before them and would continue long after their particular attempt at prominence had faded. The language was not aggressive. It was dismissive in the way of something that considers a matter fully concluded. Other species repeated these characterizations without much examination, not because they believed the Dravhari interpretation specifically, but because it was a tidy explanation for something that had been making everyone uncomfortable, and tidy explanations are very appealing when you have been uncomfortable for 3 weeks, and nothing more has happened. I watched all of this from my station. I took notes. I filed careful, factual reports. I said nothing in the public forums I had access to, because what I had to say required more context than a public forum would receive well. And in private, I kept mapping. Because the silence had a shape. I had started noticing this around the 17th day, a structural quality to the absence of signal that became clearer the more data accumulated. The silence was not uniform. If it had been simple grief, simple breakdown, simple retreat, it would look flat, the featureless absence of something that had previously been present, distributed evenly across all the frequencies and directions where human signal had once existed. What I was seeing was not flat. Human vessels had not stopped moving. They had changed their patterns of movement. The changes were individually small. A cargo runner that normally traveled a specific trade corridor between a coalition waypoint and a Dravhari-adjacent market station had shifted its heading 11 degrees to the galactic north, following a course that added roughly 4 hours to its transit time, but kept it measurably farther from the Dravhari boundary. A survey vessel scheduled for deep space mapping in the outer boundary region had reversed its heading 17 days ahead of its planned return date, moving back toward human-occupied space at standard cruise velocity. A diplomatic support shuttle that had been parked at a neutral waypoint for routine maintenance had quietly relocated to a position significantly closer to the inner human systems. A science station that normally broadcast continuous passive data on its ongoing research programs had gone completely dark, with no prior notification and no explanation. Each of these individually was explainable. Ships change course. Vessels come in early. Stations go quiet for maintenance. If you looked at any single one of them, you saw nothing significant. I was not looking at any single one of them. I was looking at all of them together, plotted against each other and against the Dravhari territorial boundary in 3 dimensions, tracked across 22 days. The picture they made together was unmistakable. Human presence was contracting, not randomly, not uniformly, not in the panicked scatter of retreat under pressure, deliberately contracting, pulling back from the zone around the Dravhari territory, consolidating toward human-occupied space, clearing an area. The way you clear a workspace before beginning something that requires unobstructed room. And the contraction was directionally specific, to the galactic south and east, toward coalition-neutral space, toward the species that had issued condemnations, toward the research stations where human scientists had long-standing collaborative relationships with non-human colleagues. Human vessel patterns remained essentially normal. They were not pulling away from the relationships that had been respectful. They were pulling away from the direction that held the thing that had cost them Alara Voss. This was not a species in psychological collapse. This was a species arranging itself. I documented this in a separate file I had begun keeping outside the official reporting structure. Not to hide it, I intended to incorporate it formally eventually, but because the official structure had a limited appetite for analysis that moved beyond what the data literally showed, and what I was seeing required me to think about the shape underneath the surface. On day 22, I went directly to Orvith. He was in his office. He had the expression of someone who had been expecting a visit but had mixed feelings about it arriving. I had been his observer for 11 years, and he had learned to read my mood variations, which was, in this case, probably an inconvenience for him. I sat down without being asked. I put my portable display on the desk and walked him through the vessel movement map in detail. Every shift, every course change, every repositioning, plotted in 3 dimensions against the Dravhari territorial boundary and the human home systems. I showed him the mathematical regularity of the clearing zone, the way the contracting ships described a boundary that was geometrically consistent rather than random. I showed him how the directional specificity of the consolidation was inconsistent with grief-based withdrawal and consistent with coordinated operational positioning. He looked at the map for a long time. "How confident are you?" he asked. "Confident enough that I moved my go bag from next to the door to next to my desk 3 weeks ago," I said. He was quiet again, a longer quiet than he normally allowed himself. "What do you think they are positioning for?" he asked. "Something directed at the Dravhari," I said. "Something coordinated, because the positioning is too mathematically regular to have happened independently across that many vessels, and something that has been in preparation for longer than 22 days, possibly much longer, because the scale of coordination required is not something you assemble in response to a crisis." He looked at the map again. "You think this was prepared before the broadcast?" "I think the capability was prepared before the broadcast," I said carefully. "I think humanity looked at this galaxy when they arrived, made a judgment about what it might eventually require of them, and built for that requirement, quietly, over years, while simultaneously and sincerely pursuing every other approach first. Ilara Voss was not a distraction from a military plan. She was the genuine first attempt. The preparation behind her was what they built so they would have options if the first attempt failed." He stood up slowly, without saying anything, and walked back toward his office. I watched him go and understood. He needed to sit with it. On the 48th day of the silence, I found something I had not been looking for. I had been running a deep scan of the station's passive signal archive, the vast, mostly useless repository of electromagnetic phenomena that the station's instruments recorded continuously, but that no analyst ever reviewed, because the content was cosmic noise, and the processing cost was not justified by the intelligence value. I was using it as a last resort, after everything else had been exhausted. I found a pattern in the noise. Not a transmission in any conventional sense. A modulated structure in the electromagnetic background, repeating on a cycle, encoded in a mathematical cipher that had been specifically calibrated to fall below the detection threshold of every automated system I was aware of. The modulation was elegant, precise in the way of something that had been tested against real detection systems, and adjusted until it was invisible to all of them. If I had not been scanning with a specifically constructed filter built from 2 weeks of theoretical speculation about what a deliberately undetectable coordination system might look like, I would have passed over it the same way every previous scan had. I spent 4 hours decoding what I could reach of it. It was a census, not a military communication, a census. A listing of every human vessel and installation in the relevant region of space, with current positions, crew complements, operational status, and updated course headings. A complete, real-time picture of where every human asset was and where it was going, updated on a rotating cycle, broadcasting invisibly in the noise floor of natural electromagnetic background. It had been transmitting for at least 19 days. Which meant that while the galaxy watched a communications blackout, while the Dravhari celebrated the silence as defeat, and the coalition analysts worried about psychological collapse, human vessels had been coordinating continuously on a channel that no one knew to look for. The silence was not silence. It was a different kind of voice, a voice specifically designed to sound like nothing to anyone who was not supposed to be listening. I transmitted my findings to Orvith immediately. He was in my section in under 5 minutes. He read the decoded census twice. Then he sat down next to my monitoring station and said nothing for 3 full minutes. "How long to build something like this?" he asked. "Years," I said. To develop the encoding scheme. To test it against existing detection systems and calibrate the signal to be invisible to all of them. To install the receiver hardware on enough vessels that they could use the system seamlessly. To establish a transmission network capable of broadcasting from multiple points simultaneously. They built it before she went to the meeting, he said. They built it so the option would exist if she didn't come back, I said. They sent her hoping this would never need to be used, but they built it so that if it did, they would be ready. He stood up and walked back toward his office without speaking. I looked at the census signal still cycling in the noise floor, quiet and invisible, keeping an entire people coordinated in the dark, and I thought about what it meant to prepare so thoroughly for a failure you were doing everything possible to prevent. The Cordelia moved on the 51st day. Alara's ship, sitting dark and unresponsive at its last position since the broadcast, close enough to the Dravhari platform to be observed but far enough to avoid seizure, changed its heading. Slowly, steadily, without announcement. It turned and began moving away from the Dravhari boundary, not quickly, not urgently, the movement of a vessel that has somewhere to be and all the time it needs to get there. I watched it go on long-range sensors until it passed beyond reliable tracking range. There was something significant about the Cordelia leaving. I could not fully put it into words, but it felt, the way these things sometimes feel in the gut rather than the mind, like the closing of a waiting period, like the last thing that had needed to happen before something else could begin. That night I organized my complete monitoring archive. Everything from the beginning, the silence, the census signal, the vessel movements, every note and analysis and recommendation, organized carefully, stored in 3 backup locations. Then I wrote a summary document, not for the record or the archive, for whoever might need to understand, at some future point, what had happened and in what order. At the end I allowed myself 1 paragraph of personal observation. I wrote, "It should be documented that humanity did not begin this. They came with open hands and practiced gestures and 12 years of study, and a woman who had named her child after a foreign concept of peace. They were met with 4 seconds. Whatever follows, the accounting must begin there, because the species that is about to demonstrate something in the dark between the stars is the same species that sent a woman with a leather folder full of handwritten proposals, believing that how you offered peace mattered as much as the offer itself. They were not wrong to believe that. The galaxy was wrong to let it be proven. I saved the document. I looked at the go bag next to my desk. I looked at the stars. The Cordelia was gone. The census signal was cycling in the noise floor, and humanity was quiet in all the ways the galaxy could see. But in all the ways the galaxy could not see, it was speaking very clearly. And I had been the one listening. And what I had heard was a people that had tried everything they believed in first, and was now, with the patience of something that has been thinking in the quiet for a very long time, almost ready to be necessary. I spent the 48th night running through everything I had documented about human military capability, not the official coalition assessment, the raw data, ship registries, weapons platforms, drive system specifications, defensive array configurations. What I found was not surprising in itself. Humanity's official military was smaller than most people expected from a species of their population. They had prioritized exploration over expansion, contact over dominance. Their naval fleet was well maintained but modest in scope. Nothing in the official files suggested a significant threat to an established galactic power. But there were gaps. 17 classified research programs, visible in the registry only as program numbers with no attached descriptions. 4 separate shipyard installations on the outer edge of their solar system that had been off the public registry for 9 years. A series of navigational buoys distributed throughout their territorial space that, when I mapped them carefully against standard shipping routes and navigational arrays, did not match any commercial or scientific purpose. They formed a pattern. When I plotted them on the 3-dimensional star map, the buoys described something that looked unmistakably like a sensor grid, a very large, very thorough, very quietly assembled sensor grid covering the approaches to human-occupied space from 6 different directions. Not the grid of a species managing commercial traffic, the grid of a species that wanted to know who was coming before anyone arrived. The oldest deployment date I could find on a buoy in that network was 31 years ago. 31 years before Ilara Voss. 31 years before anyone had cause to look at humanity as anything other than a promising new species trying to find its place in the community of galactic peoples. I sat with that number for a long time. I thought about what it meant to build a sensor grid 31 years in advance of the moment you would need it. I thought about what it meant for a species to spend 12 years preparing an ambassador, learning a language, studying a culture, naming a child after a foreign concept of peace, while simultaneously and quietly assembling the infrastructure of a very different kind of readiness. Not aggressive, not looking for a fight, simply prepared, the way a people is prepared when it has read its own history and understood that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes, and that the most responsible thing you can do for the people you love is make certain that the worst outcome, if it comes, cannot catch you entirely unready. They had been ready for a long time. They had simply been hoping, the entire time, that ready would never have to mean necessary. The 48th day was the day I found the census signal. And when I finished decoding it, when I understood what I was looking at, I called Orvith and he came to my section in 5 minutes, which was the fastest I had ever seen him move, and he sat next to my monitoring station and was quiet for 3 full minutes, which was the longest I had ever seen him stay quiet. "Who built this?" he finally said. "People who understood our detection systems well enough to defeat all of them," I said. He was quiet again. "They were ready," he said. "Not a question." "They have been ready," I said, "for a long time. They just didn't want to be." He stood up and walked back toward his office without saying anything else. The census signal kept cycling in the noise floor, quiet and invisible, and steady. And I kept watching, and the silence kept telling me everything I needed to know. The message arrived at 6 hours and 12 minutes into the day cycle, on a morning that looked completely ordinary from the outside. I had been at my monitoring station since before the station lights shifted from night mode to day mode, which had become my pattern over the past several weeks. I could sleep when I needed to, but sleeping felt like not watching, and not watching felt like a failure of attention I could not permit myself. Orvith had mentioned twice that I showed signs of extended wakefulness. I acknowledged his observation both times and continued. The message came through the official Coalition Human Diplomatic Band at 6 hours and 12 minutes. That band had been completely dark since the silence began. In 59 days, not a single signal had passed through it. Its appearance on my monitoring board was so unexpected that I spent a moment simply confirming what I was seeing, before I processed what the signal actually contained. It was not a transmission addressed to anyone specific. It was an open broadcast, sent in plain, unencoded standard galactic across the entire diplomatic band simultaneously. Within the first 30 seconds, I confirmed that it was originating from at least 400 separate transmission points distributed throughout human space. Not a single source broadcasting widely, which would have been the conventional approach. 400 independent sources, each transmitting identical content at the same moment, synchronized to within a margin of microseconds across a space that encompassed light hours of distance. The level of coordination required for that synchronization exceeded anything I had a reference point for in my monitoring experience. 400 clocks, kept perfectly in time across an enormous volume of space, firing together at a single agreed moment. I read the message once. Then I read it again. Then I sat very still and read it a third time, because some things need to be read 3 times before you let yourself respond to them. It said, in Standard Galactic, and below that in 6 other major galactic languages including Dravhari. Witness. This is what patience costs. The coordinates below mark the location of Herath 4. The timestamp below indicates when observation will be most instructive. We suggest you watch. Below the text were precise navigational coordinates, and a timestamp. 14 hours and 19 minutes from the moment I was reading. I did not file a report first. I picked up my direct communication device and called Orvith personally, outside standard protocol. He answered on the second signal. "Vasek." "Check the diplomatic band right now," I said. "Now." A pause. I heard him move, then silence on his end, for approximately 25 seconds. Then, quietly, "Get the staff to the shelters." "We're not in the target area," I said. "The station should be safe." "I know we should be safe," he said. "Get them to the shelters anyway." I understood. It was not about physical safety. He needed people in a controlled location, while he had time to think about how to manage what was coming. I called the all-hands alert. The staff gathered in the main briefing room, confused, not quite alarmed but moving toward it. Orvith addressed them calmly. He told them we had received an unusual communication from human sources. He told them the station was in no danger. He asked everyone to remain in the shelter wing and limit external communications pending further assessment. He did not read them the message. He did not mention the coordinates or the timestamp. When he dismissed them, he held me back. "Tell me what it means," he said. "In 14 hours and some minutes," I said, "something is going to happen at the Dravhari Primary Fleet anchorage at Herath 4, and humanity has just invited the galaxy to watch." He was quiet. His hands were folded in front of him, very still. Why would they want witnesses? "Because this is not just a military action," I said. "If they wanted to act without being observed, they have spent 2 months demonstrating that they are fully capable of it. They chose to broadcast the coordinates and a timestamp on every available diplomatic channel. That is not tactical necessity. That is communication. They are sending a message, and they want it received clearly and on record." "What message?" he asked. I said carefully, "it is the message they chose instead of the one they sent with Alara Voss. She was their first message. They wanted to begin with something gentle, something hopeful, something that offered the best of what they were. This is their second. And the reason they want witnesses is so that everyone who saw the broadcast of her falling on a platform will see this on record as well. The sequence is the point." He was quiet again. Then, "What is the installation at Herath 4? Approximately 400 combat vessels in residence, command station, repair yards, munitions infrastructure, 9,000 personnel, estimated. It has been the Dravhari's primary operational center for the region for 2 centuries. He processed that. "And what do you believe they are going to do to it?" "I don't know the exact mechanism," I said honestly. "I know they have capabilities we haven't fully documented. The missing drone suggests something that can remove objects from tracked space cleanly. The census coordination system suggests communications architecture significantly more advanced than their public profile indicates. Beyond that, I'm speculating about method. I'm not speculating about intention." He nodded once. "Get your sensor array calibrated for the Herath 4 region. Full recording capacity. Everything documented." "Already running," I said. I went to my station and did the most intensive preparation work of my career over the next 13 hours. I mapped every object in the region surrounding Herath 4 that my instruments could detect, applying the pattern analysis methods I had developed over the previous 2 months. The methods that looked past the surface noise to the structure underneath. Low signature items. Objects present, but not broadcasting. Things that would read as ambient clutter to a standard scan but that resolved, under more focused analysis, into objects with internal consistency, with deliberate positioning. They were there. I found 12 in the first 2 hours, then 6 more, then another 9 as my analysis refined. By the time I had completed a full systematic survey of the region, I had located 41 objects positioned at specific points around the Herath 4 installation, distributed across 6 approach vectors, spaced with mathematical regularity, far enough from the installation that their passive presence would read as ambient to any standard sensor sweep. But when I mapped them in 3 dimensions, the formation they described was not random. It was the optimal coverage arrangement for a simultaneous directed event from multiple angles simultaneously. 41 positions chosen by someone who understood exactly what coverage geometry would look like, and had the patience and capability to place assets at each position, without being detected doing it. They had been placed over weeks, during the silence. While the galaxy was watching a communications blackout, and concluding that a species had gone quiet in defeat, 41 objects had been positioned, carefully and invisibly, to be exactly where they needed to be. In the last hour before the timestamp, I ran my sensor calibration checks 3 times. I confirmed my recording systems twice. I verified the data routing to all 3 backup archives. Then I sat down and waited. The timestamp arrived. For the first 4 seconds, my sensors showed nothing different. Then the readings changed. What happened at Herath 4 over the next 4 minutes and 32 seconds is documented in the official Coalition archive in technical detail that my instruments recorded with precision. I am not going to describe it here in the language of spectacle, because spectacle would not be accurate to what I actually observed. What I observed was numbers, readings on instruments, data that I had to interpret through frameworks and analysis tools, because what was happening exceeded the scale of direct sensory experience. The 41 objects discharged simultaneously. The synchronization was exact. The specific mechanism involved a directed manipulation of gravitational field geometry that my instruments clearly recorded the effects of, but that I lacked the technical framework to fully categorize from my position. The discharge lasted exactly 4 minutes and 32 seconds, from first energy reading to the final return of readings to baseline. In 4 minutes and 32 seconds, the Dravhari primary fleet anchorage at Herath 4 was no longer a functional military installation. The combat vessels were disabled, not destroyed in the sense of complete material elimination, but rendered inoperative in ways that my sensors confirmed would not be quickly reversible. The command station was down. The munitions infrastructure had been caught in what my instruments described as a cascade suppression event, which held stored energy in contained states rather than releasing them, a feat of technological control that my training had no existing category for. The physical support infrastructure that had taken 2 centuries to build was reduced, in the time it takes to breathe 8 times, to something that would require decades of committed effort to restore. I ran survival probability calculations for the 9,000 personnel. 63% estimated survival rate. I ran them again because I needed the numbers to mean what I thought they meant. 63%. Not the number you get when the objective is elimination. The number you get when the objective is to disable capability, while leaving enough people alive to carry the knowledge of what had happened forward. A number that says, we are not trying to destroy you as a people. We are demonstrating something. We are making sure you understand what the demonstration means. The event was complete. 6 minutes after the readings returned to baseline, the human diplomatic band came alive. A single signal, 1 transmission point, clear standard galactic, entirely ordinary in format. The United Earth government acknowledges the events of this morning. We are available to resume diplomatic contact with the Galactic Coalition at the earliest convenient session. We have matters we would like to discuss. We will see you soon. Nothing else. No declaration of victory. No enumeration of grievances. No claim of justice served or lesson taught. A professional, measured, completely ordinary diplomatic communication, as if the past 60 days of silence had been a scheduled interval, and now normal operations were resuming. I sat at my station for a long time. Then I began writing. 4 hours, without stopping. Everything from the beginning, the silence, the census signal in the noise floor, the vessel movement analysis, the 41 objects, the event at Herath 4, the survival probability figures, the follow-on diplomatic communication. I documented it with the completeness and precision that the moment deserved. At the top, before the executive summary, I wrote 1 paragraph that would not normally appear in an intelligence report. This document should be understood as beginning not at Herath 4, but at a meeting on a diplomatic platform, where a woman named Elara Voss extended her right hand open and was not received. Everything in these pages flows from those 4 seconds. Any analysis that does not begin there is incomplete. I sent the report. Then I called my family. I told them I was well. I told them things had changed and that I was still understanding what the change meant, but that I was well. I meant it entirely. Outside my window, the stars looked exactly as they always had, except that I understood now, in a way I had not before, what lived between them, and what it had just finished doing, and what it was already reaching back toward. I spent the 13 hours before the timestamp doing the most intensive preparation of my career. I mapped every object in the region surrounding Herath 4 that my instruments could detect, applying the pattern analysis methods I had developed over the previous 2 months. Low signature items, objects present but not broadcasting, things that registered as ambient clutter on a standard scan, but that resolved, under more focused analysis, into objects with internal consistency. With deliberate positioning, I found 12 in the first 2 hours, then 6 more. Then 9 more as my analysis refined. By the time I had completed a full systematic survey, I had identified 41 objects at specific points around the Herath 4 installation. They were distributed across 6 approach vectors, spaced with mathematical regularity, far enough from the installation that their passive presence read as ambient to any standard sensor sweep. But when I mapped them in 3 dimensions, the formation they described was not random. It was the optimal coverage arrangement for a simultaneous directed event from multiple angles. 41 positions chosen by someone who understood exactly what coverage geometry required, and had the patience and capability to place assets at each position without being detected doing it. These objects had been placed during the silence. While the galaxy was watching a communications blackout and concluding that a species had gone quiet in defeat, 41 objects had been moved into position, carefully and without any detectable signature, to be exactly where they needed to be when they were needed. Not a response to an immediate crisis, a prepared capability, deployed against a predetermined scenario. They had known this scenario was possible. They had built for it. They had hoped they would never use it. In the last hour before the timestamp, I ran my sensor calibration 3 times. I confirmed my recording systems twice. I verified the data routing to all 3 backup archives. I checked the feed that would capture the event at HFY 4 and confirmed it was running at maximum resolution. Then I sat down, folded my hands, and did the only thing left to do. I waited. The timestamp arrived. For 4 seconds, my sensors showed nothing different. I was counting. I needed to know exactly when it began, the way I had needed to know exactly how long it had taken for something else to end. Then the readings changed. I will not describe what the sensors showed in the language of spectacle, because spectacle is not accuracy. What I saw was data, numbers, instrument readings that I had to interpret through analytical frameworks because the scale of what was happening exceeded direct sensory experience. My instruments recorded it with precision. The numbers were accurate. The event unfolded within the bounds of physics as I understood it. But those bounds turned out to be broader than the galactic scientific consensus had believed. The 41 objects discharged simultaneously, synchronized to within microseconds, across a volume of space that measured in light minutes. The specific mechanism was a directed manipulation of gravitational field geometry, a technology that the Coalition's scientific community had considered theoretically possible but practically unachievable due to power requirements and engineering constraints that were, apparently, not as absolute as previously believed. The discharge lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. I watched my sensor feed with the steady, necessary attention of a professional doing their job, and I documented everything, and when the readings returned to baseline I sat for a long time without moving. The Dravhari primary fleet anchorage at HFY 4 had ceased to exist as a functional installation. The combat vessels were disabled, not destroyed in the sense of complete material elimination, but rendered inoperative in ways my instruments confirmed would not be quickly reversible. The command station was down. The munitions infrastructure had been caught in a cascade suppression effect I had no existing reference for. The repair yards were gone. The infrastructure that had taken 2 centuries to build had been reduced, in 4 minutes and 32 seconds, to something that would require another century to restore. I ran survival probability calculations. 63%. I ran them again. 63%. The number you get when the objective is not elimination but demonstration. When you want enough people alive to carry the memory of what happened to everywhere that memory needs to reach. When you are sending a message, and you need living recipients to receive it. They had not tried to kill everyone. They had tried to make certain no one could forget. 6 minutes after the readings returned to baseline, the human diplomatic band came alive. A single signal, 1 transmission point, clear standard galactic, entirely ordinary in format, as if the past 60 days had been a scheduled maintenance period, and the system was simply back online. The United Earth government acknowledges the events of this morning. We are available to resume diplomatic contact with the Galactic Coalition at the earliest convenient session. We have matters we would like to discuss. We will see you soon. No elaboration, no declaration, no claim of victory or justice or satisfaction. A professional, measured, completely ordinary diplomatic communication. I sat at my station for a long time after I confirmed the signal. Then I started writing. 4 hours. Everything from the beginning. I documented it with the precision and completeness the moment deserved. At the top, before the executive summary, I wrote 1 paragraph that had no business being in a formal intelligence report. This document should be understood as beginning not at HFY 4, but at a meeting on a diplomatic platform where a woman named Elara Voss extended her right hand open and was not received. Everything in these pages flows from those 4 seconds. Any analysis that does not begin there is incomplete. I sent the report. Then I called my family. I told them I was well. I told them things had changed and I was still understanding what the change meant, but that I was well. And I meant it. And somewhere outside my window, in a space that was different than it had been that morning, the stars looked exactly the same. Except I knew now what lived between them. And I suspected the galaxy was about to find that out as well, in the way that large things find things out, all at once, whether or not they were ready. The session was scheduled for 47 days after the events at HFY 4, which was the fastest the Coalition's administrative apparatus had ever moved on anything in my documented experience of working within it. I had watched that apparatus process emergency declarations that sat in preliminary committee for 6 months. I had watched treaty amendments circulate through 3 subcommittees before reaching a full session. I had never, not once, seen a session convene in fewer than 3 months from initial request. The human diplomatic notification had gone out on the morning of the event. The session request had been formally registered before that same afternoon's cycle ended. The preliminary committee review, normally its own multi-week process, had been completed in 72 hours. Context adjusts timelines. The galaxy moves quickly when it understands that the thing requiring discussion is not a matter that will wait politely for procedural scheduling. I arrived at the Coalition's Central Assembly Station 12 days before the session. This was unusual for someone in my role. Field observers were typically present for a brief window around the events they were brought in to contextualize, arriving shortly before, departing shortly after. 12 days early was something closer to what you do when you cannot bear to be far from the thing that is about to matter. Orvith had arranged a place for me in the observation gallery above the chamber floor. He explained this in a message shorter than his usual communications, and in its brevity, I heard the quality of a person who had been doing a great deal of thinking and had resolved to act on the results of that thinking in specific ways. The gallery was normally closed for sensitive sessions. That it was open for this one, specifically for me, was an acknowledgement that something I had spent months trying to communicate had turned out to be worth taking seriously. I did not make anything large of this. I simply arrived when I was supposed to, and took my seat and prepared to pay the kind of attention I had been paying for 11 years, but which now had different weight behind it. The chamber held 412 delegate seats, arranged in a broad arc around a central floor space. Every seat was filled. I had been in that chamber for routine sessions with half the seats empty, which was normal. Most Coalition business did not command full participation. Today there was not one empty seat. Along the side walls, groups of additional delegates stood in clusters because several species had sent more representatives than their allocated seating could accommodate, and the administrative staff had made the practical decision to allow the overflow rather than turn anyone away. I had never seen the chamber at that capacity. Not for anything. The ambient sound level was notably lower than it should have been for a full session. A chamber with 412 delegates normally produces considerable background noise. Greetings, procedural discussions, the particular music of a large professional gathering finding its order. Today there was conversation, but underneath it was a quality I had learned to recognize across many years of watching rooms where something significant was about to happen. A specific kind of attentiveness, the way a room sounds when everyone in it is trying to appear more composed than they actually feel. The human representative arrived through the main floor entrance exactly 5 minutes before the scheduled start. I had expected a delegation. In 11 years of studying human diplomatic behavior, I had understood that they sent teams, specialists for each relevant domain, advisors for foreseeable contingencies, people whose expertise covered the anticipated range of a session's possible directions. Elara Voss had traveled with a diplomatic staff of 8, in addition to the Cordelia's crew. Human contact teams were thorough, prepared for multiple scenarios, and rarely traveled without adequate support when the stakes were significant. She arrived alone. She was, by human aging estimates, somewhere in her early 30s. Not tall. Her build was slight enough that she occupied the central floor with a physical presence notably smaller than most of the delegates surrounding her. She wore a plain gray suit. No insignia, no diplomatic decoration, no marker of rank or title. Her hair was pulled back without ceremony. She carried nothing. No document case, no data tablet, no personal communication device. Her hands were empty. She walked to the delegate position and sat down. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. She looked toward the center of the chamber, and she waited for the session to begin. The chamber got quiet. Not the polite administrative quiet of a session finding its order. The other kind. The kind that happens when something in the room causes 400 people to simultaneously realize that they should be paying close attention. The speaker, Veth Oras, 20 years in the role, someone I had observed opening hundreds of sessions with unfailing professional composure, cleared his throat before beginning the procedural formula. That small, involuntary sound told me more about the atmosphere in the room than any formal statement could have. He ran through the standard opening correctly, because 20 years of practice makes certain behaviors automatic. Then he said, "The session recognizes the representative of the United Earth government." She looked up from the table, where her eyes had been resting during the procedural formula, not in disrespect, but in the way of a person using a quiet moment to finish settling their thoughts. She said, "Thank you, Speaker Oras." Her voice carried easily in the chamber's acoustics, clear, even, not loud, but present. She paused for one breath. Then, "I am not here to explain what happened. You watched it happen. I am not here to justify it. The record exists. I am here because the United Earth government would like to understand where we stand with this body, and with the species represented in this room." The chamber was very quiet. She continued. 2 months ago, humanity was characterized by the Dravhari Empire as a primitive infestation, unworthy of galactic discourse. That characterization was delivered over a live broadcast, while our ambassador stood on a platform to which she had been formally invited. Our ambassador was a woman named Alara Voss. She was a linguist and a diplomat who had spent 12 years studying the Dravhari language and culture, because she believed that speaking to people in their own language was a form of respect. She came without a security detail. She came carrying a leather folder full of proposals she had written by hand. She greeted the high executor in the formal Dravhari manner, correctly, because she had practiced until it was part of her body's knowledge, rather than only her mind's. She did not complete her presentation. She stopped there. A brief stop, the specific kind that is not calculated for effect, but happens because you are speaking about someone real who is gone, and speaking about people who are gone is different from speaking about policy positions. Then, we went silent after that. Many of you have wondered what the silence meant. Some have drawn conclusions. I am going to be direct with you. We went silent because we were making decisions. Decisions about the nature of this galaxy and what it requires of a species that wishes to remain in it safely. Those decisions took time to make correctly. We believe we made the right ones. We are prepared to be accountable for them. A delegate from the Karath Assembly raised their identification marker. The speaker acknowledged them. The Karath delegate said, "The events at Herath 4 constitute an act of unprovoked force against a sovereign galactic power. The Dravhari Empire, regardless of any prior incident, holds rights under coalition law that..." The human representative raised one finger lifted from the table where her hands were folded, slowly, held still. The Karath delegate stopped mid-sentence. I noted this carefully in my personal records. The delegate was not interrupted. No one else spoke over them. The speaker did not call for order. The delegate simply stopped, on their own, because something about that single raised finger communicated a quality of patient, absolute attention that made continuing feel inappropriate. The delegate stopped because the room understood, without anyone explaining it, that the representative had something to say, and the delegate would have the floor again after she was done. She said, "I heard the question." She said it gently, without hostility. "I want to establish the factual record before we discuss legal frameworks. The Dravhari Empire executed our ambassador on a live broadcast after she had greeted their representative with an open hand and had not done anything that any reasonable interpretation could call threatening. That event was not a policy disagreement. It was not a diplomatic breakdown. It was a statement about what they considered our species to be. We heard that statement. We chose to respond to it in the most direct terms available. That is the complete sequence. That is the accurate record." She looked at the Karath delegate. "The legal framework question is a reasonable one, and I am prepared to discuss it in detail. but the discussion should begin from an accurate account of what happened, in what order, and with what intention on each side. Silence in the chamber. Then she said the thing I had not anticipated, and which I believe genuinely surprised most of the room. We do not want to be this. She said it simply, without performance. I want to make that completely clear before we continue. The United Earth government has no interest in establishing a posture of intimidation in this region of space. We have no territorial ambitions. We have no interest in empire. We want trade routes that function fairly and without harassment, which has not been the case for the past 30 years. We have documented incidents involving 17 human vessels and 2 science stations across that period, and we are prepared to discuss every one of them in dedicated sessions. We want our research collaborations to continue and expand. We want our people to move through this region of space as part of a larger community of peoples, not as a presence to be managed or a power to be monitored. She paused. We tried to be your neighbors, she said. We sent you a woman who named her child after the concept of peace, in a language that was not her native language, because she loved that idea so much, she wanted to give it to someone she loved. That was our first message to this galaxy. We want very much for it to not have been our last. The chamber was absolutely quiet. Then the senior Valoon delegate, 30 years in his seat, a man I had never heard speak outside of procedural order, said, without raising his identification marker, "What do you need from us?" She looked at him. A moment passed between them that I cannot fully describe, but that I understood had weight. Honesty, she said. We need to know who in this room intends to be a neighbor, and who is waiting to see whether we can be managed. We are out of patience for the second category. No one laughed. No one in the room felt like laughing. The session ran for 9 hours and 40 minutes. I stayed in the gallery for every minute. I ate from my pocket. I did not leave my seat. I watched everything. By the end of the second hour, 12 species had offered formal apologies for historical incidents involving human vessels. These were not symbolic gestures. They came with specific incident citations and specific acknowledgments, which meant each of those species had reviewed their own records and identified what they needed to account for before coming to this room. That kind of preparation takes time. It meant the review had begun before the session was scheduled, which meant it had begun in the days after Harith 4, which meant that the message had been received and processed before anyone spoke a word in this chamber. By hour 5, a draft framework for a revised Human Coalition Navigation Rights Agreement was being developed openly on the chamber floor, not by administrative staff in a committee room, by delegates themselves, working through the text in real time, the human representative participating directly. Draft documents were normally the product of weeks of committee work. What I was watching was 400 delegates collectively deciding they did not have time for the committee process. By hour 7, the Dravhari's remaining delegation had formally requested a private meeting with the human representative after the session's close. The request was acknowledged and accepted without drama. By hour 9, a joint statement of principles had been agreed upon by 391 of the 412 delegate seats. The 21 abstentions were primarily Dravhari-aligned species, calculating where the political landscape would settle before committing publicly. This was noted, understood by everyone in the room, and not commented upon. There was a collective pragmatic patience at work, a recognition that 391 was enough to begin, and that the remaining 21 would find their way to the table when the surrounding landscape had settled. The human representative signed the joint statement without ceremony. She read it once, signed where indicated, set the document down. Then she looked up at the chamber. "Thank you," she said. Then she stood up, gathered nothing, because she had brought nothing, and walked out exactly as she had entered. Alone, unhurried, carrying nothing in her hands. I watched her go. Then I looked around the chamber, at 400 delegates in the specific state that follows the arrival of information that requires you to update your picture of how things are. Not crisis, not resolution, recalibration. The slow internal adjustment of a mind that has just been shown that its previous model was incomplete. I thought about what she had said, that they had sent a woman who named her child after the concept of peace in a foreign language, that they wanted that to not have been their last message. The most important thing that had happened in 9 hours was not the navigation framework, or the formal apologies, or the joint statement. The most important thing was an old Valoon delegate asking, out of order, without permission, "What do you need from us?" And the answer had been honesty. Not fear, not submission, not tribute or deference or political acknowledgement of demonstrated capability. Just honesty. I stayed in the gallery long after the chamber emptied. The cleaning staff worked around me without comment. I stayed because I wanted to remember what the room felt like after something had shifted in it, the specific quality of a space in which the world is different than it was when you entered, and the difference has not yet settled into the ordinary texture of how things are. The chamber felt like the first morning after a very long night. I did not know what the day that followed would bring, but for the first time in a long time, I thought it might be worth finding out. After the formal session closed, I stayed in the gallery for a long time. The cleaning staff came in and worked quietly around me. They did not ask me to leave. People who have been sitting very still for a long time in empty rooms are not an unusual sight in places where important things have recently happened. I stayed because I wanted to remember the quality of the room after something had changed in it. Rooms feel different after a shift, not always dramatically, not always in ways you can easily name, but differently in a way that is impossible to ignore once you have learned to pay attention to it. The specific texture of the air, the particular quality of the light, the way a large empty space holds the echo of what happened in it, briefly, before the ordinary work of the world moves back in and replaces the echo with the present. The chamber felt like the first morning after a very long night. Not comfortable, not resolved, not the false peace of a problem concluded. Simply different from before, carrying the particular quality of a situation in which the shape of things has changed and neither side has yet fully registered what the new shape means or requires of them. I thought about what the representative had said, that they did not want to be this. I had been watching humanity for 11 years. I had spent more time with their history and their communications and their behavioral patterns than any other analyst in the coalition's monitoring system. I had filed more reports about them than anyone else in my organization. I had argued for them, in the professional sense, in report after report that came back with priority flags removed. And in all of that time, across all of that data, the one thing I had never doubted was this: they had always meant it when they reached for peace. It was not calculation. It was not diplomatic positioning. It was not the strategic presentation of a species concealing aggressive intention. They had meant it every time, from the first contact application to Alara Voss, to the message that invited the galaxy to witness what patience costs. They wanted the bridges. They wanted the conversations. They wanted to stand on platforms with open hands and say the words in languages they had learned out of respect, and hear something worth hearing in return. They had built the alternative because they were also a species that had read their own history, and their history was very clear on what happens to peoples that have nothing but hope. You need the hope. You keep the hope. You send it out into the world in the form of the best people you have, carrying leather folders and speaking in languages you spent years learning. And you build the alternative, quietly and without announcement, because the alternative is the thing that lets hope remain possible over the long term, the thing that makes peace durable, rather than just desirable. They had always understood this better than they were given credit for. And now, 6 weeks after the events at Herath 4, sitting in an empty chamber on a neutral station, while the cleaning staff worked around me, I understood it better than I ever had before. The session had changed things, not perfectly, not completely, not in ways that would resolve cleanly or immediately, but the framework had shifted. The underlying structure of the relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy had moved in ways that were already difficult to reverse, and would become more difficult with every week that passed. 12 species had formally apologized. 391 had signed the joint statement. An old Valoon delegate had asked, out of order, what humanity needed. These were not small things. They were, in fact, exactly what the human representative had said she wanted: honesty. The acknowledgement of what had happened, and in what order, and with what intention on each side. It was not everything, but it was the beginning of something real. I left the chamber when the cleaning staff finished their work, and the lights began to dim for the overnight cycle. I walked through the corridors of the assembly station, which were quieter now than they had been that morning, but still populated, delegates making their way to communications suites. administrative staff finishing the day's filings, the ordinary background activity of an institution that had just done something historically significant and was now returning to the practical work of being an institution. I found a quiet alcove with a bench and sat down. I pulled out my personal document and wrote for a while about what I had seen in the chamber, the way the representative sat, the way she raised one finger, the way the old Valoon delegate had spoken without permission, and what that small violation of protocol had revealed about the size of what he actually felt. I wrote about Alara Voss. I wrote about what it meant that the same people who had done what they had done at Herath 4 were now sitting in a chamber, asking not for fear, but for honesty. That they were still reaching. That they were still hoping the reach would find something worth holding. Then I put the document away and went to find a communication terminal, because I had been away from my family for a long time, and there are things that are more important than professional documentation. My partner answered, and looked at my face, and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said. "I think so. I think things are different now, and I am still learning what that means. But yes." They asked when I was coming home. I said I did not know yet, but soon. They said they missed me. I said I missed them too, and I meant it in a way that felt more specific than it usually did, because I had been thinking for months about people who were missed and would not be coming back, and that makes the ordinary word heavier in your mouth. We talked about small things, our children, a repair needed at the house, a book my partner had been reading, small ordinary things, the kind that exist in the periphery of every life, and that you tend not to notice until you have been away from them for long enough to feel their absence. I listened to all of it very carefully. Then, when we finished and the screen went dark, I sat in the communication alcove for a moment and simply breathed. Then I got up and found dinner, because I had not eaten properly in 2 days, and there was still work to do in the morning, and the work required my full attention, and my full attention required food. Some things, as I had learned from years of watching a particular species, are very simple. You eat. You rest. You come back to the table. You keep trying. That is the whole of it. They asked me to conduct the debrief myself, which I had not expected. The Intelligence Directorate's standard process for post-session witness interviews involved a team, multiple analysts with structured roles, a formal questioning protocol, a transcript produced for the archive. My function as a field observer was supplementary, context and background, not primary investigation. But the Directorate had reviewed 11 years of documented human behavior analysis and decided that for this particular interview, someone familiar with the subject should be present. So I found myself, 41 days after the coalition session, sitting across a plain table from a man named Owen Garrett in a small conference room on a neutral station. Owen was one of 11 survivors from a Dravhari logistics outpost in the outer ring of the Herath system, not the main anchorage, a smaller installation that had housed roughly 400 people, a mix of Dravhari civilians and third-party contractors from several neutral species. The outpost had been outside the operational radius of the event. Its residents had observed from a distance and been evacuated by coalition rescue vessels within 2 days. Owen had been there as a logistics analyst from a neutral trade company, on a 26-month placement that had been in its 14th month when the silence began. He was human. That was why the Directorate wanted me in the room. He was in his early 30s by human aging estimates. He had the specific calm of someone who has been interviewed many times in a short period and has made a practical peace with the process. Not withdrawn, not guarded, simply settled into the rhythm of it. He sat with good posture, and his hands flat on the table. His eyes were clear and direct. I told him we were recording. He acknowledged it. I told him he could decline any question. He acknowledged that too, with the expression of someone who did not intend to use that option. He described his experience on the day of the event in a full account that took 40 minutes. He covered everything from the moment the census signals had gone quiet 4 days prior, which he had noticed and understood, because he worked with fleet disposition data professionally, to the moment the evacuation vessel completed its transit to the neutral station. He had known what was coming, not in specific mechanistic detail, but in the essential fact of it. As he described it, the whole community understood what the silence meant. I asked him to explain. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, precise. When a person goes quiet, he said, you know they are thinking. When an entire community goes quiet together, you understand that the community is thinking. We are 400 billion people. We went quiet within hours of each other. There was not one person I know who did not understand, in those first days, that we were not going to let what happened go unanswered. Let it go, in what sense? I asked. He considered this carefully. Not revenge. That is not the right word. Revenge is reactive. It happens because you are hurt, and you want to hurt back. What I felt, what I think most of us felt, was something different. A decision about what kind of relationship we were going to have with this galaxy. Whether we were going to be the kind of people who could be treated the way Alara Voss was treated and simply continue as before. And the answer was no. I asked, were you frightened during the silence? Of what was being decided? He was quiet again, a longer quiet. Not of what we were going to do, he said. Afraid of what it would cost us to become capable of it. There is a difference. What happened at Herath 4, I do not experience it as something that made us stronger or better. It made us something we could have been without, if the galaxy had let us be. He looked at the table. Being afraid of becoming the kind of thing that can do that is different from being afraid of doing it. I was afraid of the first, not the second. I wrote that down exactly as he said it. Then I asked him to tell me what it felt like when the event began, when he was watching the sensor data from the outpost. He was quiet for a long time, longer than before. I had been anticipating it for weeks, he said finally. I knew it was coming, because of how the objects were tracking in the positional data. I work with fleet disposition data, so the pattern was readable to me, even though it was designed not to be readable to automated systems. When it started, I was at the sensor board. I had been expecting it, and I assumed, that the moment it actually happened would be enormous. The size of all the anticipation behind it. What did it feel like? I asked. He looked at the table, a long pause. Like closing a door at the end of a very long day, he said. Not throwing it, not slamming it, just closing it. The way you reach out when you are tired, and the day is over, and you need it to be over, and you pull the door shut, and the latch catches, and the sound it makes is quiet, and final, and necessary. That is what it felt like. Necessary, final, quiet. I wrote that down word for word. Then I said, do you think it was the right thing to do? He met my eyes. We tried everything else first, he said. That is the first thing I would want anyone analyzing this to understand. We have documentation going back 30 years of attempts at ordinary good faith engagement with species that treated our vessels as lesser, that required inspections of our cargo they did not require of equivalent others, that denied our researchers access to facilities open to everyone else. We tried the patience of formal complaint processes. We tried diplomatic channels. We tried sending the most qualified and committed person we had to a meeting she had spent 12 years preparing for. He paused. We tried everything else first, and we have records showing we tried everything else first. That matters. Not because it makes what happened at Herath 4 comfortable to live with, because it does not, and I would not want you to think we are comfortable with it, but because the shape of how something happens is part of what the something is. The sequence is part of the meaning. I sat with that. Then I said, tell me about Alara Voss, not the official record, as a person. He shook his head slightly. I did not know her personally, but I know the kind of person she was, because we have many people like her. People who go toward the hard thing because they believe the hard thing is worth going toward, who spend years on something difficult because the difficulty does not diminish the value of the work, who choose to stand in rooms where they are not safe because they believe the standing there matters. He looked at the table for a moment. She was right about what she believed, he said. The going toward the hard thing was right. The outcome does not change the belief. The outcome is what happened afterward. The belief is what she was. A long silence. Do you think the galaxy will understand that? I asked. What she was. He was quiet. Then he said, almost to himself, in a tone that was not performance but the specific quietness of a person saying something they actually mean. The people who matter will understand it. The rest will learn when they need to. That is all you can ever ask. I ended the session 20 minutes later. I thanked him, and he nodded, and he left. I sat alone in the small plain room for a while, before gathering my notes. I thought about closing a door at the end of a long day. The particular sound of a latch catching. The way something final can also be quiet. The way necessary and quiet and final can all be the same thing at the same moment. I had watched the HFY sensor data in real time. I had run the survival probability calculations twice. I knew what the numbers meant in terms of actual people. And I thought about how a species that had done that could also produce a woman who named her child after a foreign concept of peace, who practiced a greeting gesture until it was part of her body, who carried handwritten proposals in a leather folder to a platform where she had reason to be afraid and stood there anyway. Both of those things were true about the same people at the same time. And that was not a contradiction. That was the whole of them, held together. I gathered my notes. I walked into the corridor. I stood in the ordinary traffic of the station for a while. People from a dozen species doing the ordinary work of their days. Then I found a communication terminal. My partner answered and looked at my face and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said. "Things are different now and I am still understanding what different looks like. But yes." They asked when I was coming home. I said I didn't know yet, but soon. They said they missed me. I said I missed them too, and meant it in a way that felt more specific than it usually did, because I had been thinking for months about people who were missed and would not be coming back, and that sharpens the ordinary word. We talked about small things, our children, a repair needed at the house, a book they had been reading. I listened to all of it carefully, the way you listen to small things when you have recently been reminded how much they weigh. When the screen went dark, I stood in the alcove for a moment. Then I went to find dinner. Some things are very simple. You eat, you rest, you come back. The debrief with Owen Garrett was not the only interview I conducted during that period. The directorate had assembled testimony from 7 other witnesses, coalition station personnel who had been monitoring the Herath-4 region, a Dravhari logistics officer who had survived the outer outpost evacuation and agreed to speak through a neutral translation service, 2 science researchers who had been conducting collaborative work at a station near the edge of the human territorial boundary and had observed the silence from that position. Each interview added something to the picture, but Owen stayed with me the longest because of the specificity of what he said and the quietness with which he said it. I spent a good portion of my remaining time on the neutral station writing notes from that interview. Not the official transcript, that was handled by the archivists, my personal notes, the ones that recorded not just what was said, but what I understood from what was said, the layer underneath the words. What I understood was this: the silence had not been strategic in the way I had initially framed it. Strategy implies a distance between the decision maker and the decision. The silence had been more immediate than that. It had been a community-wide response that was simultaneously individual and collective. 40 billion people each separately arriving at the same understanding, and each separately choosing, without coordination, to go quiet. Not because they had been told to, not because a government directive had been issued, because the silence was the natural expression of a shared understanding of what the moment required. Owen had said, the whole community understood what the silence meant. And he had meant it literally. Not that word had been passed through official channels. That 400 billion people had looked at what happened on that broadcast and had, each on their own, without instruction, understood what the next step was. That kind of coherence, the kind that does not require instruction because the understanding is already shared, is the result of something very old and very deep in how a community has been shaped over time. It is not manufactured. It is grown. Humanity had been growing that kind of coherence for a very long time. Their history made that clear. The patterns I had found in 16 hours of reading, the cases where they had absorbed a blow and then, in the quiet, reorganized the entire structure of their situation. Those patterns only worked the way they worked because an entire community could, without explicit coordination, move in the same direction at the same time, because the shared understanding ran deep enough to produce collective action without requiring collective instruction. The silence had been that, 40 billion people, each understanding separately, all acting the same way, all at once. I wrote all of this in my notes, and then I sat with it for a while. Then I wrote something else, that the thing that made humanity coherent in the way that mattered, the thing that had allowed an entire species to go quiet simultaneously, to coordinate an invisible fleet through a signal no one knew to look for, to prepare for decades for a contingency they spent equal energy trying to prevent, was the same thing that had produced Alara Voss. The same commitment, the same depth, the same willingness to invest everything in what they believed in. She had invested 12 years in the hope that it would not be necessary. They had invested decades in the preparation for the possibility that it would be. Both came from the same place, the same understanding of what was worth doing, and the same refusal to do less than what the moment required. I packed my things that evening and arranged my departure from the neutral station for the following morning. I had been away from Caven 7 for 6 weeks, and the monitoring work there would not wait indefinitely. The galaxy was different now than it had been when I left, and the difference required close observation. I said goodbye to the few colleagues I had spent the most time with during the process. The investigators, the archivists, the administrative staff who had kept the process running. I thanked them for their work. Then I went to my temporary quarters and finished the section of my personal document that I had been working on during my time there. I wrote about Owen Garrett and his hands flat on the table and the clarity of his eyes and the specific quietness with which he said the things that mattered most. I wrote about the sound of a door closing at the end of a long day. I wrote about what it means for a community to understand something so deeply that the understanding produces action without requiring instruction. And then I wrote something that I had been circling for weeks without quite landing on. The reason Alara Voss mattered was not only that she had been exceptional, but the reason she mattered in the way she mattered was that she had been possible, that the community she came from was the kind of community that could produce her, that produced people like her not as accidents, but as expressions of who they had decided to be. And the same community that had produced her had also produced everything that had followed. Not despite each other, because of each other. Both were expressions of the same thing. I closed my document and lay on the bunk in the temporary quarters and looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow I would go back to Caven 7, and the day after that I would sit at my desk and watch the stars and do the work. And the work, now, was different than it had been. Not easier, not simpler, not resolved. Just different, in the way that things are different after something irreversible has happened and the world has moved through it and kept going. I was grateful to be in the world that had kept going. I thought that was worth noting. I thought Alara Voss would have agreed. I was asked, in the weeks following the coalition session, to give testimony to a closed investigative panel examining the events at Herath 4 from the perspective of a senior coalition intelligence observer who had been monitoring the situation from close proximity throughout. It was not a comfortable experience, which I had expected. Being in a room with 7 investigators who were still working out what they thought about something tends to be uncomfortable, particularly when you know things they are still reaching toward and you can watch them reach. The lead investigator was a senior legal analyst named Porith Davan, who had been with the Coalition's judicial oversight body for 18 years, and who had the precise, methodical manner of someone accustomed to separating what they could prove from what they suspected. She was thorough. She was also, underneath the precision, clearly working through something that did not fit cleanly into her existing frameworks. She began by asking me to summarize my monitoring experience over the full duration of the silence period. I summarized. It took 2 hours. She listened without interrupting except to ask for clarification on technical terms or to request that I slow down at certain points. She took notes on a physical document rather than a digital device, which I found noteworthy. It suggested she wanted a record that existed only where she controlled it. At the end of the summary, she set her note-making tool down and looked at me. "At what point," she asked, "did you first become confident that what you were observing was not grief or psychological withdrawal?" "Around the 17th day," I said, "when I mapped the vessel movement patterns and found directional specificity inconsistent with disorganized retreat. And at that point you filed a report recommending diplomatic outreach." "Yes." "Which was declined." "Declined and returned with the priority flag removed." She made a note. "And your evacuation recommendation, on the 14th day after the initial directional pattern became clear, also declined." 6 votes to 2, correct. "You mentioned that 2 votes were in favor. 1 was yours. Do you know who the second was?" "I learned afterward that it was a Pelrani senior observer at Post 9. who had independently reached similar conclusions. She made another note. Then she looked up. Let me ask you something outside the scope of the formal inquiry. You do not have to answer if you prefer not to. I indicated that I would hear the question. Throughout the silence period, she said, did you believe that what humanity was preparing to do was justified? The question sat in the room for a moment. That is not a clean question, I said finally. I know it isn't, she said. That is why I am asking it informally, rather than for the record. I thought about how to answer honestly. I believed, I said, that what humanity was preparing to do was a direct consequence of what was done to Alara Voss. Whether it was justified depends on what framework you apply to the sequence of events. If you apply the framework of conventional coalition law as written, then an argument can be made that the response exceeded proportional bounds. If you apply the framework of a species that watched its ambassador executed on a live broadcast after coming to a meeting in good faith, and that had spent 2 months in preparation while exhausting every remaining diplomatic option, then the argument looks different. She was quiet. What I believed, I said, was that humanity had tried everything else first. I believed that because I had documentation showing it, and I believed that whatever else the events at Hareth 4 were, they were the response of a people that had been given no other option that they could accept. That does not answer the question of justified, but it answers the question of necessary, and for me, at that moment, necessary was the more meaningful question. Porith Devan made a long note. Then she set the tool down and said quietly, I appreciate the honesty. It is what they asked for, I said. She looked at me. The human representative, I said, in the session. When they asked what was needed from this body, the answer was honesty. I have tried to take that seriously. A small pause, then she said, so have I. She picked her note-making tool up again. Let us continue with the formal inquiry. We continued for another 3 hours. By the end, I had the sense that the panel had not reached resolution on what they thought about the events at Hareth 4, but that they had gathered the factual foundation from which resolution might eventually emerge. That was perhaps the most that could be expected. Some questions do not have clean answers. Some events require years of sitting with before the right frameworks for understanding them become clear. I was not asked to wait for those frameworks. I was thanked for my time and released from the panel's process. I spent the evening in my temporary quarters on the neutral station writing in my personal document, the long account I had been building across many months. I wrote about Porith Devan and her physical note-making tool and the question she asked me informally. I wrote about what it meant to try to answer honestly when the question does not have a clean answer. And I wrote about what I kept returning to, in all the quiet hours of all these weeks, the fact that humanity had tried everything else first, that the record showed it, that they had sent person after person and proposal after proposal, and attempt after attempt, into a galaxy that was not always interested in receiving what they were offering, and that they had built, alongside all of that trying, a preparation that they had hoped they would never need. They had not wanted the preparation to become necessary. They had simply understood, better than most, that wanting peace and being prepared for its failure were not contradictions. They were the same commitment, expressed in 2 directions. The Directorate eventually issued its formal findings on the events at Hareth 4. The document was careful, measured, and genuinely grappled with the complexity of what it was analyzing. It acknowledged the context of Alara Voss's execution. It noted the 30-year record of documented harassment of human vessels. It found that the events at Hareth 4 represented a response to a sequence of provocations that the existing diplomatic infrastructure had failed to adequately address, and recommended the development of stronger protections for diplomatic envoys of all species, stronger enforcement mechanisms for the harassment protocols that had been consistently violated in the preceding decades, and a formal review of coalition procedures for responding to the execution of diplomatic personnel. It did not formally exonerate what had happened at Hareth 4. It also did not characterize it as simple aggression. I thought that was probably as close to honesty as a formal institutional document could get about something that existed in the uncomfortable space between categories. In my personal document, I wrote something simpler. They tried everything else first, and the galaxy let them run out of options, and the galaxy should sit with what that cost everyone, including itself. Then I closed the document and went to sleep. Tomorrow there would be more work. There was always more work. But for one night, I let the work wait. I had been waiting long enough myself, for long enough things, that I understood the value of a night that was simply a night. Outside the window of my temporary quarters, the stars of a neutral station's sky were the same stars they had always been, distant, countless, indifferent to the particular dramas of the particular species moving between them. But I knew now what the space between those stars contained. And I knew that what it contained was still reaching, still trying, still hoping the reach would eventually find something worth holding. The closed investigative panel met over 3 days. It was not a trial. Nothing about the panel had the formal structure of legal proceedings. It was closer to a structured inquiry, the Coalition's attempt to understand what had happened at HFY 4, completely enough to begin the work of determining what it meant for future policy. Porith Devan, the lead investigator, was thorough in a way I found genuinely impressive. She did not seem to have made up her mind in advance about what the panel should find. She seemed to be actually looking for what was true, which is less common in formal institutional processes than it should be. I gave my testimony over the first day and a half. The investigative structure she used moved chronologically, which meant we began with the broadcast and moved forward through every stage of what I had observed. She stopped me frequently for clarification. She asked me to explain technical details that required background to understand. She asked me to distinguish between what I had directly observed and what I had inferred, and she kept those categories clearly separated in her notes. The hardest part of the testimony, for me, was the section on the coordination signal. When I explained what the census signal was, what it had taken to build it, how long it must have been in preparation, what it implied about the depth of human planning, Devan stopped me and asked me to repeat the key elements more slowly. She wanted to be certain she understood the full significance. So they had built a communication system that was invisible to all of our detection protocols, she said, when I had finished. Yes. And they had built it before the broadcast, before the execution of the ambassador. The technical specifications of the system make it impossible for it to have been assembled in response to the broadcast. The encoding architecture alone would have taken at least 2 years to develop and test. She made a note, a long one. And in your assessment, she said, what does that preparation indicate about their intentions at the time they built it? It indicates, I said carefully, that they understood the galaxy was a place where their good intentions might not be sufficient protection, and that understanding did not cause them to abandon the good intentions. It caused them to also build the alternative. She looked up from her notes. The alternative being what happened at HFY 4. The alternative being the capability that was used at HFY 4, I said. The decision to use it came after the broadcast. The capability existed before. She was quiet for a moment. Then, in your professional opinion, did the capability exist because they intended to use it? In my professional opinion, I said, it existed because they intended to be capable of it, which is different from intending to use it. A species that builds a fire suppression system in a facility is not planning for a fire. They are planning for the possibility of a fire, and hoping the planning never becomes necessary. Devan made another note. The analogy is imperfect, I added. What happened at HFY 4 is not equivalent to fire suppression in scale or consequence, but the structural relationship between the preparation and the intent is similar. The preparation was built to protect something, not to threaten something. She set her note-making tool down. What were they trying to protect? I thought about how to answer that accurately. The possibility of being the kind of species they wanted to be, I said. A species that sends people like Alara Voss into rooms where she might not be safe because they believe the going matters. A species that learns languages out of respect and writes proposals by hand and names children after foreign concepts of peace. A species that can do all of those things and mean all of them, without becoming vulnerable in ways that make the next generation of people like her unwilling to go. Devan looked at me for a moment. That is a generous interpretation, she said. It is the interpretation supported by the complete record, I said, including the 30 years of documentation on harassment of human vessels that nobody adequately addressed, including the diplomatic notification they sent immediately after HFY 4, which reopened every channel they had closed, including the content of the coalition session, where they asked not for fear or deference but for honesty. I paused. A species planning dominance does not ask for honesty. A A species that has spent a very long time trying to be part of a community and being repeatedly failed by that community, and has finally demonstrated what the consequence of that failure looks like, and is immediately afterward asking to be taken seriously enough to have an honest conversation. That is something different. She looked at her notes for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Observer Oren. I think that is enough for today." We continued over 2 more days, but the tone of the subsequent sessions was different. Quieter, more reflective. Less like a structured inquiry and more like a large and difficult conversation being conducted carefully. The panel's final findings were measured and honest in the way that good institutional documents sometimes are. They did not exonerate the events at Herath 4. They did not characterize them as simple aggression. They found that the events were a response to a sequence of failures, the execution of a diplomatic envoy, the inadequate coalition response, the 30-year record of unaddressed harassment, and they recommended significant structural reforms to the diplomatic protection protocols, the harassment enforcement mechanisms, and the coalition's procedures for responding to incidents involving diplomatic personnel. They were not perfect findings. They could not be, because the events they were describing did not fit cleanly into any existing category. But they were honest. And in my experience, honest is the most you can ask of a large institution grappling with something that does not fit into its existing frameworks. I left the panel's final session and walked through the corridors of the neutral station for a while before going back to my quarters. I needed the movement. I had been sitting for 3 days. I thought about Ilara Voss's pages scattered across a platform floor. I thought about a census signal cycling in the noise floor, invisible to everything that was not looking for it. I thought about a woman who had raised one finger in a chamber and let the room decide for itself what that meant. I thought about an old Veloon delegate asking, without permission, "What do you need from us?" And I thought about 400 billion people going quiet at the same moment, without being told to, because the silence was the only honest expression of what the moment required. I went back to my quarters. I wrote in my personal document for a while. Then I went to sleep. In the morning I would begin the journey back to Caven 7. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. But the work had changed. The work had become something more than monitoring. It had become, in some way I was still finding the words for, a kind of witnessing. And witnessing mattered. I intended to keep doing it for as long as I was able. 6 months after Herath 4, I was back at Caven 7. The station looked the same. My desk was in the same position. The observation window showed the same stars. The monitoring console had been updated with 2 new software versions during my absence, which I spent my first afternoon back learning, because the tools of the work change, even when the work itself does not. I sat differently in my chair now, less anxiously, with a quality of attention that had settled into something more like purpose and less like vigilance. The distinction is not easy to describe to someone who has not felt both, but it is real. Vigilance is watching for the thing you are afraid of, and purpose is watching, because the watching itself matters. I had both for a long time, and now I was settling into something that was primarily the second. The go bag was still next to my desk. I had not put it away, and I did not plan to. Not because I expected another crisis, but because it reminded me of something worth carrying in memory, that watching carefully had mattered. That the 11 months of reports and analysis and recommendations had not been futile simply because most of them were returned with the priority flags removed. The 2 votes on the evacuation recommendation had been 2 votes cast on the basis of accurate understanding. That mattered even when it had not changed the outcome. Sometimes what matters cannot be measured in outcomes. The Cordelia was back in service. I had confirmed this through routine monitoring about a month after my return. It was assigned to a scientific survey program in the outer systems, crewed by a new team, carrying equipment for deep space observation and planetary mapping. Wherever the next person was who would eventually carry forward the kind of work Ilara Voss had spent her life doing, the patient, careful, committed work of building bridges across the enormous distances between species, the ship she had traveled on, was out there among the stars, doing the ordinary work of learning what the universe looks like up close. I found that I was glad about this. In a small, specific way, not a dramatic one, in the way of being glad about something that is simply right. 3 species had completed formal apology processes with the human government and were in active trade negotiation. The processes had been thorough. Specific incident citations, specific acknowledgments of specific failures, the full architecture of accountability that distinguishes a genuine apology from a statement. 2 more species were in preliminary discussions. The surrounding political landscape had shifted in ways that were still settling into their final shape, and the work of understanding what that shape was going to be would occupy diplomatic analysts for years. The Drovhari remnant, the surviving leadership structure operating from secondary installations, had gone publicly quiet. I monitored their channels as a matter of professional habit more than expectation. They had nothing useful to say. They were in the process of understanding what they had become, and that process was theirs to manage. I had been writing, in the quiet intervals of monitoring work and in the evenings, a long document. Not a report, not a memo, a record, an account of what I had seen over the past 2 years, written for no particular audience, in no particular format, following no particular template. Just the shape of what had happened and what it had come to mean to me, told in the order it had arrived, and in the language of someone who had been paying close attention to the whole of it. It was longer than anything I had ever written for my own purposes. I still did not know what I would do with it when it was finished. Give it to the Coalition archive, perhaps, as a personal perspective document, or keep it personal. The decision could wait. What I knew was that I needed to write it, because I had been watching from the window when Alara fell. And I had been the analyst who found the census signal hiding in the noise floor, and I had been in the gallery when the human representative raised one finger and a chamber of 400 delegates found that it could not continue until she was ready. Those things happened, and I had seen them whole and in context, and they deserved to be recorded by someone who had been paying the right kind of attention. The formal archives would record the facts correctly, but facts and meaning are not the same thing, and the meaning of what I had watched over 2 years was something the facts alone could not carry. The meaning was this: a species had gone out into the galaxy with a genuine intention to be part of it, not to dominate it, not to reshape it, not to take from it by force. To be part of it, to learn its languages and study its cultures, and build relationships with its peoples and contribute to its collective understanding, and participate in its trade, and share the experience of existing in an enormous and interesting universe, with every other species willing to share that experience. They had tried this sincerely. For years, they had sent their most skilled and committed people who named their children after foreign concepts of peace, who spent 12 years learning to speak without an accent, in languages not their own, who carried handwritten proposals to platforms where they had reason to be afraid, and stood there with open hands anyway. Then the galaxy took one of those people from them in 4 seconds on a live broadcast in front of 40 billion witnesses, and they went quiet. And in the quiet, they did not become something different. They remained what they were, a people that wanted to be neighbors, that wanted to contribute, that wanted the ordinary daily life of existing alongside others in a shared universe. They simply ensured, with the precision and patience that was also always part of who they were, that they would never again be in the position of wanting those things, from a position that made the wanting dismissible. They had not needed to stop being themselves. They had only needed the galaxy to take them seriously enough to let them be. Now, 6 months on, in the slow and imperfect and entirely real process of that adjustment, the galaxy was beginning to. Late one evening at my monitoring station, alone with a warm cup and the stars in the window, and the quiet of an empty section, a new entry appeared in my log. Human diplomatic band, routine advisory. A survey vessel in the outer system, notifying traffic management of a minor course adjustment. Standard format, standard content, the ordinary administrative traffic of ships doing their work. I noted it and marked it routine. Then I sat back and looked at the stars. I thought about Owen Garrett and what he had said in the small conference room, that the people who matter will understand it, that the rest will learn when they need to, that this is all you can ever ask. I thought about the 2 votes on my evacuation recommendation. I thought about the Pelrani observer who had written to me afterward, formally, to compare notes, and who had mentioned that he had also packed a bag before things became necessary. I thought about 12 species formally apologizing, 3 in active trade negotiation, 2 in preliminary discussions, an old Valoon delegate speaking without procedural permission because the question could not wait. I thought about a woman who had been right about what she believed, even though the outcome had not been what the belief deserved. The most dangerous thing about humanity was not their patience, or their preparation, or their capacity to coordinate across vast distances in ways no one had known to look for. These were real, and they were significant, and they had changed the political shape of this region of space in permanent ways that would take years to fully understand. But the most dangerous thing, the thing that I could not stop thinking about, the thing that had been sitting behind my eyes for 2 years like a stone I was still carrying, was that they genuinely wanted to stop. They wanted to be done with all of it. They wanted trade routes and research collaborations and navigation rights, and the ordinary texture of being a people among peoples in a large and interesting universe. They wanted to send more people like Alara Voss. They wanted to fill more leather folders and stand on more platforms and speak in languages they had learned out of respect. They just needed someone to let them. And they had made very, very clearly, not with aggression, not with ambition, but with the quiet, absolute clarity of something that has been patient for a very long time and has recently had reason to stop being quiet. What would happen if the galaxy chose not to? The stars outside my window were where they always were. And somewhere between them, human ships moved through the dark, survey vessels and cargo runners and science stations, doing the ordinary work of a people that had spent what it needed to spend, to be taken seriously, and was now, simply, trying to live. They were watching, with good eyes and long memories. Not with menace, but with the steady attention of a people that knows the cost of inattention. And they were still, underneath all of it, underneath the preparation and the capability, and the thing that had happened in 4 minutes and 32 seconds in the outer ring of a system called Harith, reaching for the thing they had tried first. Still believing it was possible, still hoping the view would improve. I had spent 11 years before the silence watching humanity and learning to read what they meant underneath what they said. And what I had come to understand, through all of it, through the silence and the census signal and the coalition session and the small conference room and 6 months back at a familiar desk watching the stars, was that the most important thing about them was not what they could do. It was that they had chosen, every time, until the choice was taken from them, to do something else. That they had sent Alara Voss first. That they had sent her knowing the risk. That they had hoped, sincerely and completely, that she would be enough. She should have been. The galaxy is learning that now, slowly, in the way that large things learn. Not all at once, not cleanly, not without cost on all sides, but learning. I intend to be here while it does. My job is to watch carefully and report honestly. I have never taken that more seriously than I do now. Outside the window, the stars are exactly where they have always been. And somewhere among them, in the space between the distances, something enormous and patient, and still fundamentally hopeful is moving through the dark. It knows I am watching. I think, in some way I cannot fully explain, it is glad that someone is. I think Alara Voss would have been glad too. I think she would have understood that the watching, the careful and honest and relentless paying of attention, is its own kind of hand extended, its own kind of door left open, its own kind of peace held out in the dark to whoever is ready to receive it. I keep watching. I keep the hand extended. I will keep both for as long as I am able. That is what the work requires. And the work, now more than ever, is worth doing. I was thinking about all of this late one evening, alone at my monitoring station with the stars in the window and a cup of something warm in my hands, when a new signal appeared in my log. Human diplomatic band, a survey vessel in the outer system filing a routine course adjustment advisory with traffic management. Standard format, completely ordinary. The kind of administrative traffic that appeared in my log dozens of times a day now, because human vessels were moving through this region again, in the ordinary way of a people going about the ordinary business of their lives. I noted it in the log, marked it routine, put down my cup. Then I looked out the window for a while. I thought about the 11 years before the silence, when I had been learning to read humanity through the medium of their communications and their behavior patterns and the dense academic archives they had submitted as part of their first contact documentation. 11 years of learning a people from a distance, the way you learn any complex system, by accumulating data until the data starts to have a shape, and then by paying attention to the shape until it tells you something true. I had learned a great deal in those 11 years. I had learned that they were funnier than they appeared in formal contexts, and more patient than most species gave them credit for, and deeply prone to caring about things that did not directly affect them. Their history was full of people who had chosen, at significant personal cost, to involve themselves in situations they could have walked away from, because the situation was wrong, and they could not comfortably be the kind of person who walked away from things that were wrong. I had learned that they were suspicious of power in an instinctive way that seemed to be built into their psychology from long historical experience, that they told stories about power going wrong far more often than they told stories about power going right, that their most beloved institutions were built on the explicit premise that power should be distributed and checked and questioned, because concentrated power had failed them too many times in their own past for them to trust it. And I had learned, most importantly, that what looked like contradictions in their character were usually not contradictions at all, that the same species that had produced Alara Voss, patient, committed, hopeful, genuinely invested in building something worth building, had also produced everything that followed the broadcast, and that these were not opposites in tension with each other. They were expressions of the same underlying thing, the same refusal to accept a world that was less than it could be, the same conviction that what mattered could be protected if you were willing to do the work of protecting it, the same understanding that you could want peace completely and also be prepared for its failure, and that both of those things came from the same root. The Sensor Grid, 31 years old. Alara Voss, 12 years in preparation. Both were the same commitment, expressed in different directions. I thought about what Owen Garrett had said, that the people who matter will understand it, that the rest will learn when they need to. I thought about the 2 votes on my evacuation recommendation and the Pelrani observer who had independently reached the same conclusion, and the fact that we had both been right and it had not been enough to change anything before the change happened anyway. I thought about how some things are not changed in advance of the moment that requires them. Some things can only be understood after the fact, when the shape of what happened is visible in a way it was not while it was still forming. I had been trying for 11 months to help people see the shape while it was still forming, and I had largely failed, but the shape was visible now, and the people who were looking at it, the 12 species who had apologized, the 391 who had signed the joint statement, the delegates who were in trade negotiation and preliminary discussions, the Valoon elder who had asked out of procedural order what was needed, those people were looking at it honestly. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, exactly what humanity had asked for. And it was being delivered, imperfectly and incompletely and over time, the way real things are usually delivered in a large and complicated galaxy. I looked at my monitoring log. Another routine signal, another survey vessel, another administrative communication, another piece of the ordinary background traffic of a people going about their lives. I thought about Alara Voss, who had spent her life trying to build the conditions for this kind of ordinary. Who had believed, completely, that the ordinary was worth building, that it was worth every year of study, and every practiced gesture, and every page of handwritten proposals. She had been right. The ordinary is worth building. It is worth all of it. I picked up my cup. I finished the warm drink. I noted the next signal in the log. Outside the window, the stars were where they always were, and somewhere between them, humanity was doing what it had always been trying to do, being part of the galaxy, taking up its space, reaching toward the things it believed in, and being, at last, allowed. The work continues. I will be here, watching. And what I see, more and more, as the months pass and the adjustments settle, and the galaxy slowly learns the shape of what has changed, what I see, when I watch carefully, and honestly, and with the kind of attention that this particular species has always deserved, is a people still reaching, still believing, still hoping, and being at last taken seriously enough to be met. That is what it looks like, from where I sit, watching through the observation window with the stars in front of me, and the go bag next to my desk, and 11 years, and one long silence, and a complete reconfiguration of how I understand the world, all settled into the chair beneath me. It looks like ordinary ships doing ordinary work in a galaxy that has, slowly and imperfectly, decided to let them. It looks like what Ilara Voss was trying to build, and it is worth every year of watching to see it. Every year, every hour, every moment of carefully maintained attention. This is the work. I am still here, watching.